Welcome to another of the Archaeological Conservancy's virtual lectures. Today, we're going to hear from Kelley Berliner. And Kelley has worked for the Archaeological Conservancy since 2013. She currently serves as our Eastern Regional Director, managing more than 60 preserves from Maine to North Carolina, while working with landowners in negotiating for new preserves. Kelley's background as a cultural resource manager has included positions as a field archaeologist, educator, and as a museum interpreter, all in the Eastern U.S. She has a BA from University of Toronto and an MA in Historical Archaeology from the College of William and Mary. Her background in public archaeology, community engagement, preservation, and archaeology makes her a perfect fit for her position at the Archaeological Conservancy. And so it gives me a great deal of pleasure to introduce to you our Eastern Regional Director, Kelley Berliner.
Hey, great. Thanks so much, Jim. All right, if we're ready to go here, I will share my screen. I will need the presenter status there, April, when you have a second.
You're good.
Perfect.
There you go.
Great,
Sorry about that.
No, you're fine. You're fine. Okay. Everyone hopefully can see that okay. Get my laser pointer here.
It looks great,
Okay.
Kelley, just so you know.
Perfect. Thanks, April. Okay, so before I dive into it here, just a little bit of housekeeping for everyone. In this lecture, I'm going to touch on a lot of different preserves we have in the Eastern region. It's a bit of an overview of the sites that we look at when preserving sites and a bit of a cultural timeline. So for questions, please try to hold off until the end so we can kind of consolidate them together. And if you have a question about a particular site, make a little note about its name, just so if you're asking about dates or specific contents, I can have that site name in mind. Otherwise, there's a lot to keep track of. So if you could do that and direct your questions into the chat, and we'll try to pull them all together at the very end and spend a little bit of time with them. And if there are some we don't get to, we'll follow up and try to get to those on the website later. So without further ado, tonight I'm going to talk about our preservation efforts in the East, starting with the Paleo-Indian up through the 20th century. So we have some industrial sites from that time period. So I'll give a bit of a background of what we're looking at in the East, and I'll end with a recent project that we undertook here. So I know many of you are members of the Conservancy. Thank you so much for your support. I'd like to just briefly go over what we do for those of you who maybe are new or just hearing about us or coming to this lecture via another avenue. So we're the only national nonprofit dedicated to preserving archaeological sites. We do that through the support of our membership, which is close to 20,000 people. And we've been doing this for 40 years. And in that 40 years, we've acquired more than 550 endangered sites across the country. One example here, this is Ely Mound. This is a Mississippian mound, and this is in the far reaches of Western Virginia. What do we do? Again, I'll keep this brief. We publish American Archaeology, a quarterly publication. We provide archaeological tours, and we preserve and manage archaeological sites. So I imagine for many of you, this magazine looks pretty familiar. And I also imagine we've seen a lot of you on some of our tours. So these are some of the sites that we visit here in the East. St. Mary's City in Maryland, Crown Point in New York is a French and Indian War fortification, and some longhouse sites, and both in upstate New York and up in Canada. And these sites are part of a few thematic tours we run out here. And so I'd like to include these, just so you know, we're doing tours out here in the East. This year we're doing Colonial Chesapeake, hopefully as long as it's safe to do so. That will be in October. And we visit sites like Williamsburg, Jamestown, St. Mary's City, Annapolis, and sites that also offer a Native American perspective on European contact. We do a tour on the French and Indian War, where we cover fortifications in upstate New York, across Pennsylvania, and down into Maryland. A similar tour on Iroquois, where we're looking at native cultures in New York, especially around the Finger Lakes. And then our most recent tour that we've added onto the list here is a tour of archaeology of Ontario and Quebec. So we break this up. Sometimes we just do Ontario. We'll do Quebec in the future, but that covers a lot of wonderful First Nation sites in Canada, military sites, and historic sites. So if you're looking for something to do, keep us in mind here in the East. And then finally, the heart of what we do is preserve and manage archaeological sites. So this is what I'm going to really focus on tonight in terms of what we do here in the East. So how do we preserve sites? Well, the first step is we figure out which regional office we're dealing with for that area. So I'm over here in the East. You see this smaller region here that runs Maine down through North Carolina, includes part of West Virginia. And the Eastern office is a bit of a younger office, and I always joke that's because everyone thinks the East Coast looks like this. And in some cases, you wouldn't be wrong. We do have a lot of development, Boston down through Washington. But of course, we have plenty of places that look like this. So this is in upstate New York, near the site of Crown Point. There are a lot of French and Indian War fortifications in this area. So what I tell people is there's still plenty left to preserve out here. And here's the success that we've had in the East. So you can see a scattering of these little stars here show the sites we've been able to acquire and permanently preserve. And this is a mix of prehistoric sites as well as historic sites. So what do we preserve here in the East? Well, let's start with prehistoric sites. So this example here is actually just a jog northwest from Washington, D.C., along the Potomac River. It's called the Barton site. And one thing that I always like to point out, I know we have a lot of members in the Southwest or maybe in the Midwest that are used to seeing very visible prehistoric sites with surface structures or large mounds. And we do have some mound sites out here, but a lot of our sites look like this. Just open fields. So it certainly presents a bit of a challenge when, for the most part, prehistoric sites in the East require archaeology to uncover what they looked like. And importantly, these prehistoric sites cover broad periods of time. So here, going all the way back to the Paleo-Indian period, this is a fluted point from close to the site, up through contact period. These are brass and copper ornaments from a Susquehannock Native American occupation of the site. So you can see this was a great place to be for a very long period of time. And this also includes historic Native American sites. And I like to make this distinction because a lot of times we talk in terms of, is it a prehistoric site or is it a historic site? But we also have a lot of historic Native American sites that span that contact period. So one example would be the Spikebuck Town Preserve. This is a Cherokee town located in the western part of North Carolina. And you'll see the dates here from the 1700s through the 1800s. So after Europeans have already arrived into the area, we still have continuity of Native American cultures. Now, what types of prehistoric sites? So I'm using terminology like Paleo-Indian or Woodland or contact period. And if you're not familiar with archaeology on the East Coast or familiar with archaeology at all, I like to start just by giving a general idea of the time periods of sites we're looking at, because it really helps us better understand cultural change in the region. So I'll start with Paleo-Indian sites, of course, often a very hot topic in archaeology. We're always looking to try to find sites that are earlier and earlier and earlier. And so the rough timeline here goes from 16,000 as the start date up through 10,000 BC. Now the 16,000 date gets pushed back and forth a bit. Like I said, we're always looking for earlier sites, but Paleo-Indian sites are really difficult. And a lot of that has to do with what the Paleo-Indian environment looked like in the Northeast. So going back this far, we're dealing with a period of glaciation, so glaciers extending down through Pennsylvania and then receding, which dramatically alters the landscape. So we have to keep in mind what we're seeing today when we look at Paleo-Indian sites often is nothing like what they looked like 10,000 or more years ago. And further to that, these sites are tough because this time period is marked by small, mobile bands of hunter-gatherers who are moving seasonally, who are following large game, who are moving to fishing areas. So we don't necessarily get sites that are being used for an extended period of time. So oftentimes these Paleo-Indian sites can be very ephemeral and very challenging, but they are certainly here. So one example of a very far northern Paleo-Indian site would be the Nevers Preserve. This is in northern New Hampshire, quite a large exposure of the site here. And here's some of the toolkit that comes from that site. So scrapers and other tools that were used. And what I should point out here is that this period is really marked by what is called fluted point technology. So many of you might be familiar with the term Clovis or Folsom points. That's from this time period in general. So this is down in central Pennsylvania. This is the Ebert Spring Preserve where this fluted point was found. It's a bit of a shorter point, but you can see the very clear fluting here where this would have been rested up against a piece of wood to haft it. Now, one preserve I'd like to point out dating to this Paleo-Indian period to explain a bit of the broader importance of trying to identify these early sites is the Thunderbird Preserve. So what makes this preserve unique, and this is in northern Virginia, pretty close to the Maryland border, actually, along the Shenandoah River. And what stands out about this site is that it's stratified. So instead of having a scarce scattering of Paleo-Indian artifacts, we actually have a site that has a very clear stratification or layering from the Paleo-Indian period through the Archaic and into the Woodland period. So this is really important for comparing to other Paleo-Indian sites and trying to better understand the cultural changes through those time periods, right? It's not like there's a clear start and stop, right? People obviously were moving or living continuously through them. Additionally, this site is a National Historic Landmark, meaning it's one of the most important sites of its kind in the country. And another contributing factor to that is the fact that excavations at this site exposed the remains of one of the oldest reported structures in the Western Hemisphere. So there wasn't a lot to look at necessarily. Preservation of wood materials here in the East is very difficult because of our high moisture content and acidic soils. But there were stains from post molds for a structure that were there. And I'll show you a little bit of what that might have looked like. So this site came to the Conservancy after a period of excavation in the 70s and the 80s. It was actually acquired by the Thunderbird Research Corporation, who sought to make sure that site was researched, preserved, as well as presented to the public in various forms of outreach. And ultimately, that group transferred the property to the Conservancy for long-term preservation and the potential for future research. Now, this site is in and of itself very important, but it also plays a very large role in understanding Paleo-Indian environments and regions. So William Gardner, who's an archaeologist at Catholic University, excavated the site starting in the 70s up through the 80s, and it became part of a larger body of work that he undertook to define the Flint Run complex. So to try to keep this fairly brief and simple, there's a particular band of rock outcroppings containing jasper. And jasper is very similar to chert. It's very easily worked into various tools. So these outcroppings are the location of this Flint Run complex. So a whole bunch of different types of sites related to habitation, resource extraction, tool production, so production stations, quarry sites, as well as base camps and hunting areas. So taking Thunderbird away from its very isolated, here's a singular site context, and expanding it outward with these other sites made it possible for Gardner to use that as a way to model the distribution of paleo sites. So this is important because these sites are tough to find. But by understanding their proximity or their likely proximity to resources like quarries, hunting areas, waterways, we've become a lot better at estimating where these sites are likely to be located on an environment and landscape that looks very different today. So here's an example of that flint run jasper. It comes in a variety of colors. And this is why it's hard to find these sites, because it looks very different today. Anyone who knows the Shenandoah Valley knows it's a very lush riverine environment with lots of hardwood forest. Well, at the time of the Thunderbird site's initial occupation, it looked like this. It's a much more open, tundra-like setting. And here is what the structure likely looked like at Thunderbird. So you can see here, I think this was actually used as a poster for Virginia Archaeology Month. But this was a reconstructed replica or interpretation of what the structure might have looked like based on where the post holes, where all these little wooden posts went into the ground. Now, of course, this wasn't put right on top of where it is, but in rough location, to give a sense of maybe what a shelter could have looked like, or some sort of building that was used by people during the earliest period here in the East. So a very, very exciting site. Okay, from the Paleo-Indian, we move into the Archaic period. So importantly, I have to caution everyone, I have this timeline here from 10,000 to 1250 BC. That's a long, long time. And so there's a lot of regional diversity. There's a lot of changes throughout that period from the early Archaic through the late Archaic. But for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to keep it as the broad Archaic and share some of the major changes that we see. So a lot of this arguably has to do with the changing environment. As the glaciers receded, that more northern tundra type of setting was slowly replaced with hardwood forests. So we start to see different resources in the area. Obviously more types of wood. We also see nuts and fruit trees coming in, slowly changing that landscape. So along with that, we start to see larger populations, or we see sites that suggest larger populations of people. People are still moving around. They're still moving to areas seasonally for hunting or fishing purposes, but we're getting clearer repeat visit sites. So places people are returning to year after year after year. And we're also seeing changes in tools. So more woodworking tools, things like adzes and axes. We see mortars that are used for grinding nuts and other materials. And we also see projectile points start to change as we're dealing with smaller game as opposed to large game. And a couple other factors, we see regional trade taking place. This is very often occurring along major waterways in the East. And towards the very tail end of this time period, we start to see steatite bowls. So this is an example that was found in Dauphin County in Pennsylvania. And what's really exciting about this is because earlier periods, people were certainly using vessels of some sort, whether they were woven organic materials or animal materials, but they don't really stand the test of time archaeologically. They decompose. We don't have a lot of traces of them. Well, at the end of the Archaic, we finally have a material that holds up and we can actually see in the archaeological record. So it's very important for dating sites. And steatite, many of you will know it as soapstone. It's relatively easy to carve. And so we start seeing it in the forms of various bowls or larger cooking vessels with handles and things of that type. Now, the site I feature here, this is the Dresden Preserve, located along the very beautiful Kennebec River in southeastern Maine. And this site is certainly one of the more important archaic sites in Maine because we see people using it over a long period of time. So continued usage, dense archaic site. People are still moving around, but they're coming back here. And a lot of that has to do with the resources. So the Kennebec River would have been your highway. of the Archaic period, as well as probably earlier and later, and also offered a lot of food resources. So we see sites like this. We do see smaller campsites as well, but it's very fortunate that we've been able to preserve some of these larger sites that were used over long periods of time. From the Archaic, then we move into the Woodland period. And this is what most people, I think, usually think of when they're thinking of Native American sites in the East. So these are more of your typical village site with a cluster of different houses or types of habitation, in some cases surrounded by a palisade. I use this example here. This is an example of a woodland village sketched from archaeological sites in Pennsylvania. Now, again, I have to caution, this period goes from 1250 BC through AD 1500. That's a long period of time, and there's a lot of different areas within the eastern region. So not all woodland villages look like this, but some of them do. A lot of times this palisade has to do with whether or not it was a period of conflict, and certainly these habitation structures look different. In upstate New York, we have longhouses. We'll see some examples of that. And then elsewhere, we see different forms. Now, of course, today, we don't see any of this. So for example, Coons Landing in North Carolina, this is a proto-Tuscarora site. There's not a whole lot to see on the surface there. Same with the Jeffrey Village and Rock Shelter Preserve. So again, it's hard to see, but that's the Potomac in the background there. This is just in Northern Virginia. And looking at these properties today, you would just think they're fields and woodland. So again, really have to use archaeology to understand what these villages look like. So other components of the woodland period, we have these villages, which indicates people are more sedentary. This has a lot to do with the adoption and domestication of, or adoption of agriculture and plant domestication. So growing maize in this area as it works its way up from Central America. And we also see changes in technologies. We see the bow and arrow, right? So instead of hafting projectile points onto more of a spear type tool, they're now being put onto a smaller haft and used for the bow. And then we also get clay ceramics. And this is really huge for understanding regional cultures and stylistic differences because we get different decorations on these ceramics. Sometimes it's braided cord, sometimes it's fabric or net impressed. So again, another way for archaeologists to better understand how different cultures may be interacting or defining themselves in relation to the others. From there, we move to the contact period, getting towards the tail end of the classic timeline for prehistoric sites. And again, this varies regionally, right? AD 1550 through 1750, it really depends on where the site is located in relation to the coast versus the interior. So we have Europeans coming in, we have French and English in the north, we have Spanish farther south, and we're starting to see these interactions during this period. So importantly, a lot of this is focused on trade. So we see trade items often making their way into the interior of the country long before Europeans actually do themselves. So tools like these iron axes here, these kettles, other trade items like beads, also cloth, which doesn't survive so well archaeologically, are making their way to the interior sites. And it's incredibly useful for dating sites during this time period. But of course, this period is not just about trade. It's about bringing of disease and conflict and other political forces. So we see conflict between tribes competing for European trade in terms of trying to get territories for trapping beaver and other animals to get their pelts. We see increasing conflict as European settlement puts pressure on the frontier, which gradually moves its way westward. And so we see a lot of dispersal of different Native American groups as they're either put into smaller communities or forced westward. So there's a lot going on in this time period. So even though it's, you could argue the shortest of all of those, there's a lot of upheaval and a lot of change that's taking place during this time. Taking a brief step back, the last few categories broadly define time periods, but we also have sites that I would say transcend those time periods or have their own themes. So one of those would be quarry sites. And I talked a little bit about this with the Thunderbird site, the Paleo-Indian site, because that involves the jasper quarries of that area, the Flint Run complex, excuse me. But we also have other jasper outcroppings. This is the King's Quarry Preserve in Pennsylvania. We were able to save a little quarter acre of this very large quarry site in the middle of a development. Another jasper quarry here in Maryland. And then down here, this is the Prince Edward Soapstone Quarry Preserve. So a little bit different. People aren't necessarily using this soapstone to make projectile points, but they're starting to make vessels. So very interesting site here. And this is Hannah Burris, the former owner of the property, who worked with us to make sure that site would be preserved in perpetuity. So fascinating sites that people are coming back to often over a long period of time, Paleo-Indian through contact in some cases, and a variety of materials, jasper, quartz, quartzite, steatite, rhyolite, and so on. One other thematic category I should highlight when talking about prehistoric sites are Haudenosaunee Confederacy sites, or 5 nations, now 6 nation sites. So also known as Iroquois sites. We've got a couple of names here. And this is a series of sites in New York. We've been very successful in preserving these. And if you're not familiar with the Haudenosaunee, 6 Nations, or Iroquois, what that defines is a Native American confederacy consisting of the Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, and Mohawk tribes that formed sometime between 1400 and 1650. So there's some question about when it formed, but there is no question about the really important influence this confederacy had in terms of early interactions with Europeans, early conflicts, including the French and Indian Revolutionary Wars, as well as territory and trade disputes. So to give you an idea, we're across the Finger Lakes here, moving up into the Adirondacks region. And one reason we've been able to focus on these sites so much at the Conservancy is because there are really well-defined village sequences. So people are settling in villages, usually along river drainages, and then picking up and moving every 10 to 20 years or so as they deplete the surrounding resources like firewood and so on and so forth. And these are farming people, so the Iroquois are farming. And we're able to follow these village sequences, and they've been fairly explored archaeologically. So we've been able to do a pretty good job on identifying these sites and working for their preservation, which you can see here. So I won't go through all of these sites. There's quite a number of them, but these are our Iroquois preserves from our Iroquois Preservation Project. Some of them I include a little bit liberally, such as Newton Hopper, Shelby Fort, Eaton, and Smokes Creek. These are not necessarily one of the Haudenosaunee 5 Nations, but they are of an Iroquoian type and time period. So you'll see here Seneca sites, Cayuga, Onondaga, and Mohawk. And if you have a very keen eye, you'll see there's a bit of a hole here. And this is where the Oneida were historically located. And so we work with many of the tribes here in the East, and the Oneida happen to work to preserve their own prehistoric village sites and historic village sites. So they do a good job preserving those independently, and then we work with these other nations on preserving these sites in many cases. Here's some example of the artifacts from some of these preserves. This is the Powerhouse site, turtle pipe effigy from Indian Castle. And then one of the things I find most fascinating about these sites, and it's true for many sites across the country, but is this idea of a blueprint for how these villages were laid out. So this is the Garoga site here, and I realize it doesn't look like much, but bear with me. This is a Mohawk site, so on the far eastern edges of the map I just showed you. And what we're seeing here are these topo lines that represent a very steep slope that exists on 3 sides of the site. And it's incredibly steep. I have been up and down those slopes. It's very difficult to go up and down them. But what this was a natural form of defense. So if this is really your only way in and out, and you build a little palisade, a little wall across there, you're pretty well protected. And in here, you can see some of these long longhouse patterns. These would have been shared by multiple families. They would have had multiple hearths in them. And so what's so neat about that to me is you just go to a slightly different location. So this is Cayudutta. This is also a Mohawk site. And if you look at the landform, well, goodness, it's almost exactly the same, just pivoted a little bit. So along a major waterway, very defensible on three sides. These hillsides are also great sites for middens, so people are often throwing their rubbish and various trash down these hillsides, which is fantastic archaeologically. And then one main point of entrance. So, importantly, these Haudenosaunee Iroquois sites are very diverse in and of themselves. Cayudutta had 600 to 700 people. Some of them are smaller, some of them are larger. Obviously, we're able to get a fairly tight timeline because we're looking at a village sequence, and they're very dense. People are living here in larger populations. There's a lot of material. There are repairs to the longhouses, so lots of features. But of course, this is what they look like. They look like an open woodlot today. So, need to use a bit of your imagination to just imagine the depth of importance of these sites in terms of what we find archaeologically. And over here, I should say, this is Randy Decker and his daughter. Randy preserved the Cayudutta site within his family for many years prior to working with the Conservancy for its preservation. Okay, deep breath. We're going to change gears just a little bit here and do a quick overview of historic sites. So there's a long tradition of historical archaeology in the East. Certainly Europeans have been here in the Northeast for a very long time, English, French, and Spanish, as well as many groups of other people, whether it's German immigrants and Irish immigrants, enslaved Africans who were brought here unwillingly, early religious cultures settling here, including Jewish people. So a really, really broad time period and a lot of sites to think about. Early on out here, this is sort of the birthplace of historical archaeology, studying sites like Jamestown, Williamsburg, and Plymouth, all these sites that figure very prominent in our national understanding of the origins of the United States here. And so from that has grown a very broad subset of the archaeology discipline of examining these early European settlers. Now, we do have written records from this time period, so this is a big change. We have things like land grants and deeds and inventories and probates. But of course, those documents don't tell us everything about day-to-day life, and they don't include everyone. So especially if you're in a marginalized population, you're illiterate, you're enslaved, you're poor, you might not get any mention in those records. So historical archaeology helps us to broaden our understanding of the lives of everybody from those time periods. And there are a lot of types of sites, so I'll run through these fairly quickly here. Our earliest sites are colonial sites. For this, I'm highlighting the Kippax Plantation Preserve in Virginia. This is just outside of Richmond. And it's a very dense site. We have structures from the 17th through 19th century. And I always like to include this image here. I believe this is from a Dr. Don Linebaugh, who did the archaeology at the site, of this post and ground house. So a challenge of historical archaeology, especially in the Chesapeake region. So this is the Chesapeake Bay, if you're unfamiliar, comes up along Virginia and into Maryland, very large drainage, and sort of the heart of tobacco country during early European colonization. And we get these post and ground structures because wood was plentiful. In some cases, you just wanted to build an expedient structure. You weren't necessarily going to create your brick and put in a brick foundation or stone foundation. So you just used wooden posts, and well, they don't last. So archaeologically, a lot of these sites were looking for these little stains of the post hole that would have been dug and where the post would have actually been located itself and deteriorated over time. So certainly comes with its challenges. Now this site, as I said, is pretty close to Richmond. It's in Hopewell, Virginia, which is, I'm not going to say it's quite a suburb of Richmond, but it's fairly close, and it's also close to Petersburg. So a very developed area. Now, fortunately, the previous owners, the Heretic family, understood the importance of their property. They didn't sell it off for development, and eventually worked with the Conservancy on selling that property to us to make sure it would be preserved in perpetuity. And you can see how important this is, because just a little bit more time, this would have been yet another subdivision. It's completely surrounded. So we have this little 10-acre historical archaeology oasis right in the middle of Hopewell. And importantly, this is the Heretic family house, about 100 years old, still stands on the property to this day. Now, Kippax isn't just a European colonial site, of course, right? This is a plantation site. So we start to get a lot of these multi-component sites where this was actually established by Robert Bowling as a trading center for Europeans and Native Americans. So we have a lot of beads from the site. We have items like this trade rifle side plate and other similar trade items. And we also have an African or African-American population, because this was a working plantation. So enslaved Africans that were brought here, we don't always see them clearly in the written record other than maybe inventories or counts, but we can see them through the artifact assemblages, specifically of dwelling sites. And so this is colonoware, a very interesting artifact found here in the Chesapeake region and beyond, where initially we thought this low-fired earthenware was maybe made by Native Americans using their pottery techniques, but creating European-shaped vessels. But over time, through research and seeing where these ceramics are found, it's very likely that this was an early African or African-American ceramic. And so really strong indicator of what people were doing, where they were getting their supplies or materials from. And this might have also been made by Native Americans, but in any case, it helps broaden our understanding of these marginalized populations and see how they're living. Similarly, the Arbuckle's Fort Preserve in West Virginia. This is a recently acquired preserve. You might have heard our previous lecture about this. And the main discussion about the site, is its role as an 18th century frontier fort on the very western edge of what would have been Virginia at the time. So these forts were constructed to defend settlers on the frontier against Native American raids, and they went on to play roles in various military conflicts in terms of provisioning and so on. Now, we know from Matthew Arbuckle's records who built this fort, that he likely had one or two African enslaved people who were at this property, maybe. But it's hard to know what they were doing or where they were. Well, through archaeology, we've seen that the blacksmith area here, so this was examined by Kim McBride and Stephen McBride, and in that blacksmith area, they found a metal cache, and they also found some unique artifacts, including this inscribed metal disc. Now, in and of itself, might not seem like much, but compared to other sites in the eastern region that we know are associated with Africans or enslaved Africans or African Americans, this is actually connected to West African religious tradition, these caches and these inscribed metal discs. So we take a site that we see as a frontier fort and realize it's actually a lot more complicated. And through archaeology, we could start to see maybe more invisible populations that are actually on the frontier as well and doing really significant jobs, like possibly blacksmithing, which is very, very important on the frontier. Now, we also have industrial sites. A very interesting site is the Pamplin Pipe Factory. This is down in central Virginia. So what started as a cottage industry of women making pipes and letting them dry on their kitchen windowsills or in their backyards using very excellent local clay, eventually was co-opted by larger factories and companies and turned into a large production line that was putting out millions of pipes monthly, selling them all across the country. And so these sites really give us a sense of growth of those industries and also how workers lived, because even though we can't see it back here because it's gone, this site contains workers' housing or the remnants of workers' housing. So to try to understand who is making those pipes, is it the women who started this industry? Is it other people coming in? So we can learn a lot from industrial sites as well. We do have a few religious sites here in the east. This is the Upper Lunenburg Episcopal Church in Virginia. And these are important not only for understanding early religious life, but the role the church played in community organization, in some cases politics, and generally in social life. And then finally, the last broad category is military sites. So we have a lot of conflicts that took place in the Eastern region, from Native American uprisings to the French and Indian War to the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, and various other skirmishes, has a very rich archaeological record. And in many cases, a lot of these smaller military sites aren't very well recorded. So we're left with archaeology to figure out who was occupying these sites, what was going on. For example, the Fort Littleton Preserve, this is in south central Pennsylvania. And this was one of a whole series of forts that were constructed across the state, because at that time, Pennsylvania was the frontier. So this is in the 1750s. And it became tremendously important to build these fort sites across the state as an effort to try to take Fort du Camp. So this was General Forbes during the French and Indian War against the French, trying to get the forks of the Ohio. So this is where Pittsburgh is today. So that conflict in and of itself has a lot of Native American involvement. And we also see these small forts that were used for that war, but also used to protect against Native American raids, and also in some cases as community gathering places. So they're not strictly military, they don't strictly serve one purpose. There's a lot more to learn from them. Okay, I realize that was a quick, extensive course in Eastern chronology, so thank you all for bearing with me on that. I figured I'd round out the presentation briefly by discussing one of our more recent projects to give you a bit of an idea of how we actually acquire these sites. So this is the Jamar Farm site. It's also known as the Nemasket River Village site in Massachusetts, over here in the eastern part of the state. And it's a very important site. It dates from the Middle Archaic through the late Woodland, and of course you're all experts in what those terms mean now, but it has a tremendous period of occupation that spans more than 8,000 years. So people are coming back to this site again and again and again up into the contact, or just before contact during the 1400s, when this was a Wampanoag village. So what's bringing people here is the Nemasket River. And this is a tremendous resource. It has marshlands, it has a huge herring run that continues to this day, one of the largest on the eastern seaboard, so a huge influx of fish that would have been a tremendous resource, especially in early spring when things are lean. And we see all of this through archaeology, where we've seen we found evidence of more than 70 structures on the site, a lot of features, storage pits, hearths, so on and so forth, and just really, really dense. So there's a long period of examining this site. Back in the 30s into the 50s and 60s, the Massachusetts Archaeological Society did some excavations and found a lot of very interesting artifacts, ranging from pottery to various stone tools to ornamentation to industry, such as clay balls that indicate there was likely ceramic production here. And what came to be known was that this was one of only a few sites like this remaining, because places that were great locations for 8,000 years are often great locations today. So this would be a wonderful place to put a subdivision with a river view. And that's exactly what the previous owner thought. And we had started reaching out to this developer over a decade ago saying, hey, this site's really important, what can we do to preserve it? But he was pretty intent on developing that property. So we stayed tuned, tried to see what would happen, and ultimately the result was that he decided to move forward with mitigation plans. So to have the site uncovered and excavated ultimately enough that he would be able to get state approval to proceed with the development. So here's where we're talking about here. This is the Nemasket River, just down here on the bottom. And this is the roadway up on the top. And this is really the heart of the site in here. And this was the plan. So Jamar used to be a turkey farm, so they decided that would be some creative road naming opportunities there here at Turkey Circle. And there were ultimately 8 house lots that would have gone in. And even clearing areas for these houses would have just been tremendously detrimental to the site. But that's what they started to do. So they brought in heavy equipment. And this was the Public Archaeology Laboratory was doing this work, was hired to do that work. And well, they ran into some issues. So I realize it's difficult to see here, but you might have to squint a little bit. All of these pink pin flags out here, which are pretty much everywhere, indicate features. So those might be fire hearths, they might be storage pits, they might be activity areas like where tools were being made or ceramics were being made. And they were everywhere. So to give you a bit of a better idea of what some of these features look like here in the east, you see these soil stains. Some of these could have been post holes. Here's an example here. So the site was absolutely covered in features, and it was full of tremendous artifacts like this bearhead effigy pestle, as well as ceramics and projectile points. And generally, you can imagine if people have been coming to this area for 8,000 years, there has been a lot of material that has been left here. In addition, the site has what is possibly petroglyphs on this large stone. These little cupules are thought to be petroglyphs by some researchers. Some researchers are less sure, but certainly an interesting element. And so what was there to do? Well, the developer realized at this point that it was very unlikely he would be able to pay for full mitigation, that full archaeological excavation, build the houses, and then still make any money off of this. So we waded back in, we talked to the town who encouraged us and said, yes, let's find a way to do this. So this is one of these ways in which, we keep sites on file for 10, 20 years or more because things have a way of changing eventually. So for the Nemasket River Village, or JMAR, the town of Middleborough said, hey, let's do this. We're going to get some funding from the Federal Land and Conservation Fund. We're going to need some money from the Archaeological Conservancy, and we're going to also work with the Native Land Conservancy, the first native governed land trust east of the Mississippi River, and we're going to make this work. And sure enough, we were able to do that. So the Conservancy, the Archaeological Conservancy, received funding from the Elfrida Frank Foundation in order to put our match in. And the other two groups came in as well. And ultimately, the property is now owned by the town of Middleborough, with the two conservancies having a conservation restriction on that. And there's also a cultural respect easement. So just one example of sometimes we're going out and we're getting land donated or we're purchasing it totally on our own. And then in other cases, we're working on these larger collaborative spheres with great success. And I'm really hopeful and excited that this fall, hopefully, when things have quieted down a little bit and they're safer, we can have a dedication ceremony at the site. This will have public access, so we will have some interpretive signs there. And it's just a wonderful success story that shows sometimes our persistence ultimately pays off for these really important sites. So I realized that was a lot to take in. Thank you all so much for bearing with me through that. And I would be more than happy to take questions at this time. Just give me one moment to get myself back to the screen with everybody here. Okay. All right. Oh, do I only have one question here? Oh, that's too easy. Let's see. So I have a question about the site in Connecticut. I'm guessing that was from the large site map that I showed. So that site is the Rogers site. That's located in close proximity to Lisbon, Connecticut, and that is a prehistoric site there. That's all you guys have for me this evening. That was easy.
Well, it looks like we might have, looks like we're getting a few come in.
It gives me a chance to get some water.
There's the question in the Q&A. It says, any updates on the Quarry, Pennsylvania Stone Circle?
Let's see. I imagine that, so we have recently, excuse me, let me expand that. The Quarry PA Stone Circle. Recently, we've changed our Western Pennsylvania region. So that was in our Midwestern region, and our Midwestern director, Paul Gardner, our previous Midwestern director, recently retired. And so we've shifted that region a little bit. And now Western Pennsylvania is on my side, but I don't know all the details of all the projects there. So I'm guessing that the Quarry PA Stone Circle is probably one of those projects, and I'm happy to look into that and get back to you, but I don't know off the top of my head. So I'll make a note about that one. Okay. And I also see, so from Jennifer here, what is the difference between Paleo-Indian and Indian? So great question. There isn't a difference. Paleo-Indian just defines a particular time period. So those earliest Indian inhabitants of the region, or the earliest Native American inhabitants. And that's just the terminology that we've come up with for that. Paleo referring to the geological time period to define that. So no difference. There's cultural continuity from the Paleo-Indian into the Archaic. That's just the way we break down those terms and time periods. Okay. Oh, question about our tours. Do we offer any tours that feature Native American sites in the Chesapeake area? Yes, of course. We do cover Native American sites on our Colonial Chesapeake tour, especially when we're talking about Jamestown, and in Maryland as well. We go to St. Mary's City, where they have a reconstructed Native American hamlet there. And so we don't get as in depth. There are fewer visible resources to see, but we do go to the conservation laboratory, where they have a lot of artifacts on display, as well as other sites that highlight Native American culture. So absolutely. Okay, I'm going to bump up here to the other questions for a moment. From Bruce, I have, how much effort is made to research and save sites that record environmental changes across the country? So I'll do my best to answer this. My thought is that you're talking about maybe impacts of climate change or other environmental forestation changes and things like that. I would say that it's not necessarily recent, but there is a big push more recently to consider that element of sites to try to understand paleo environments, archaic environments, and woodland environments, and how they have changed up through the present. I wouldn't say that we're specifically able to identify sites that record environmental change specifically, just because it depends on how long they were occupied. So we don't necessarily focus in on that feature, but it is often a byproduct of all the sites that we preserve, especially when they've been inhabited for a long time. There's potential to look at pollen cores and other types of analysis to get a better sense of changes that have occurred. Okay. From Facebook, what are the sites on the Delmarva Peninsula? We have a couple sites out there, actually. We have the Iron Hill Cut Jasper Quarry that I mentioned briefly in talking about Quarry Sites is located out in the Maryland portion, or very close to it. Also the Wise Wick site, which is an earlier, very early Paleo-Indian site out there, and that's in Delaware. And then we also have some historic sites out in the Virginia region of Delmarva. Okay, let me oh, there's a lot of questions here. I got myself in trouble by saying there wouldn't be any questions. Okay, from Charles, are any of these sites open to visits by the public? Yes, of course. You know, this past year, we've been a little bit more limited due to the pandemic in terms of where we're offering tours. but in many cases, a lot of these sites are available for private tours. You would contact me for that. And we do have a few that are open for public access. In particular, Jamar, the last site I covered in the lecture, is open for public access. We also have a preserve in south central Pennsylvania called Ebert Spring, and that is actually developed as a passive use park with walking trails and interpretive signage. So we do have a number that are just open year round for passive visits, and then quite a large number of them are available for tours if you contact us. Okay. Oh, here's a good one from Ken here. Given that many of the sites are normal fields and woods, how do we tell if there's a site of interest? So really great question, and it gets at the heart of what I do most of the day as the Eastern Regional Director, which is working with a large network of archaeologists in the university world, in the cultural resource management world, privately, and so on and so forth, to try to find where these sites are located, because I can't go out there and test every field, lot, and woods that I see. So we work with those archaeologists, and we work with state offices who have previously discovered sites on record that we're able to see what was found, were there features, is the site intact, how disturbed is it, and determine if it would be worthwhile to try to preserve that property. So it can be really hard. You start to learn when you're doing field archaeology where sites are likely to be located in terms of along waterways, certain types of terraces, near certain resources. So you can do a little bit of predictive modeling, but until you really get the shovel into the ground or somebody has done that before you, it can be hard to verify that. So. Okay. Next question. How much of a role have public archaeology laws played in your work? So in this case, and I apologize if I misinterpret, but I would think you're probably referring to cultural resource management law, which requires through section 106 archaeological testing prior to development. That's kind of the traditional terminology of public archaeology. In that case, quite significantly, this is how most sites are uncovered, or new sites are discovered that haven't been examined previously. But it depends on where you are and what the project is. Not every project requires Section 106 testing. That requires either federal oversight or federal laws being involved or federal review being triggered. In some cases, we do have counties or states with similar requirements. So it does play a large role in that sense. If you mean sort of what I would call like a softer term of public archaeology, which is more so outreach, working with descendant communities, collaborative practices, that's also very, very huge. In terms of working either with Native American communities or local communities that are connected to sites, that also plays a very significant role. It does vary project to project. Okay. Sorry, I'm jumping around here on these a little bit, but oh, I see. Oh, thank you for the clarification, Bruce. The environmental change question. Environmental changes, including those changes that are natural and those that are from Native Americans, are altering the environment. So we certainly consider sites that can tell us information about that as being just as important as other sites. They are really fascinating. We have a few in the eastern region where we can see either fortifications, so like mounded earthen fortifications, certainly mound sites, that's changing, but we also see areas where areas might have been intentionally changed for the purpose of encouraging better fish catches. So we have a lot of fish weirs in the east to funnel fish into one area that would have made it a lot easier to catch them. And you can still see those. You can go up and down the Susquehanna River. There are very large fish weirs. So we do try to preserve some sites that include that, but it's not an exclusive requirement for us.
Hey, Kelley.
Yes.
I know all of a sudden you've had a ton of questions, so I am going to let you take a couple more and then we can wrap it up. And if you want to answer some later on, we can post them on the website.
Yeah, that's fine for me. I'll get one or two more here. Okay, from Gerald here. With all the large populations in the East, has this kind of development over the decades almost decimated many or most good sites, especially in the Middle Atlantic region? Well, like I pointed out in my slide, this is a common thought about the eastern seaboard, the eastern region, but it's not true at all. All those sites I showed you were really wonderful, good sites that were able to be preserved. There certainly have been a lot of sites that were great locations that are now underneath Washington, D.C. or New York, so on and so forth. So it has happened a lot, and all we have are historical records of those sites to go off of. But fortunately, there are plenty of really important sites that are left. So it is a mix out here in the East. Okay, let me see if I can take maybe one more here. How can the public assist you in your efforts and work? Oh, great question. We always appreciate public interest and involvement. We do work with a lot of volunteers. In many cases, we have site stewards for our properties. Actually, for almost every single one of our preserves, we work with a volunteer site steward or site stewards who either live near the property or are a previous landowner or are a local member of an archaeological society that help us to keep an eye on these properties and make sure that we are not having trespass issues or people out there illegally. So that's just one small way. We also always encourage people to reach out to us either for volunteer opportunities or just to find ways to spread the word about archaeological preservation. So during a more normal year, we do a lot of these talks to local groups to do outreach and encourage people to get involved with their local archaeological societies and things of that nature. So certainly welcome the public interest anytime. It's easy to find me. It's easy to find my contact information. So on that note, I'll hold off on the rest of these, but I will go ahead and copy them down, and I'll work with Sarah and April to try to get them up on the webpage if that works for you guys.
Absolutely.
Great.
Well, thank you guys for coming this evening.
Yeah, thank you everyone so much for joining. Hope you enjoyed.